Love it. Hello, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us today and making time in your schedule. We've got a really exciting session ahead of us today, and we're joined by Nick from 2xe. Hey Nick, how you going? Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Good, thank you, James. Sure, James. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's having a fantastic day so far. What is it? Is it Tuesday today?
It is.
And December's just creeped up, hasn't it? Yeah, so my name is Nick Palousis. I'm the CEO and co-founder of 2xe. We exist as a business to help our clients get to net zero with the best possible holistic return on investment we can give them, which ultimately means how we help them to leverage decarbonisation and sustainability as a business opportunity to reduce costs, to save time, create business growth opportunities, and to reduce risks. And we work with businesses of all shapes and sizes, most industry sectors across Australia, and now we have a bit more of an emerging footprint and presence into Southeast Asia and parts of North America.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that, Nick. And I'm James Clements. I head up our sort of net zero property here at Wattwatchers. And if you're wondering who Wattwatchers is and what we're about, what you're looking at is an overview of the Wattwatchers technology platform that provides a really flexible ecosystem to utilize energy data in lots of different ways. Because one of the key challenges in the industry is that energy data, electricity data in particular, tends to be locked up, which means it can't be used and exploited for all the different use cases we're going to touch on today. And I'm fortunate at Wattwatchers to have the support of some great investors and some government partners that you see there on the right. So I thought we'd sort of take you all through today what the plan of attack is. We're in the introduction now. Now Nick is going to take us through the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard changes that are coming in 2025. We'll then move on to a bit of a high-level overview of what's happening with National Construction Code, NABERS, Green Star, and GRESB. Before we move on to, really, I suppose the flavour of this is really around compliance is great and can really help to stimulate action, but there's a lot more that you can do with data after you've invested in the right technology and infrastructure. So we'll help bring that to life a little bit with some case studies around how real-time data can be used not only for compliance, but also in some more interesting ways to create more value. Then we'll move on to some practical considerations you might want to consider if you're looking at adopting technology, and then move on to questions and answers where you have an opportunity to talk to us and ask questions, which would be fantastic. So without further ado, Dan, could you hand over to Nick and he'll take us through the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard changes.
Thank you very much, James. I might preface these next couple of slides by appreciating that probably a number of people on the call have possibly been inundated by people talking about the climate-related reporting legislation and the requirements for businesses to adhere to this legislation. So I'll do my best to go through as swiftly as possible because I do want to maximise the time that we have for productive questions and discussion. But just as a bit of an overview, in September of this year, so earlier this year, Australia's mandatory climate reporting regime, so along with the AASB S2 standards, was legislated in September this year. It requires businesses of certain thresholds to meet a whole bunch of, disclosure requirements relating to their climate-related risks and opportunities. So what I'll do is walk through a bit of a breakdown of what this looks like. So who's covered? There's 3 cohorts of businesses currently covered, and these cohorts will get introduced to the disclosure requirements by size, starting with the largest businesses first, so the largest in the town, Australia's businesses first, and then ratcheting down from there. I can talk a bit more about what that looks like. In terms of what disclosures will be required, well, there's a whole range of disclosures ultimately, and I've got a following slide that elaborates a little bit further. But there's a whole range of disclosures across areas around the company's governance practices and how the business's governance function, organization's governance functions account for climate-related risks and opportunities in their decision making. There are disclosures around the company's strategy, so approach to identifying, assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities, and the impacts of those risks and opportunities on short, medium and long-term financial performance. Disclosures around risk management and disclosures around metrics and targets, so specifically around the organisation's greenhouse gas emissions, the scope 1 and 2 and 3 greenhouse gas emissions footprint, as well as other non-greenhouse gas related metrics and targets relating to the management of those climate-related risks and opportunities. So it's a bit of a mouthful. There's a lot of things you've got to be able to disclose, but obviously we've got some examples down there. Disclosing any transition plan if the company has one, identifying the body that's responsible for the oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities in the company, reporting on scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, assessing climate resilience and disclosing any application of things like internal carbon prices. Where will the disclosures be located? So ultimately, companies will be required to lodge a separate report to that of the existing set of reports that is required to submit. So traditionally, the companies are required to submit a financial report, a director's report, and an audit report. So 3 reports. Under these disclosures, the organisations will be required to submit a sustainability report, which is the summary against those disclosures mentioned, and which will be called basically the 4th report in the annual reporting suite. When will this disclosure process commence? Starting from January of next year. So, companies who report on calendar year, for example, their first report, and who are in Group 1 or Cohort 1, will be required to report starting from will be required to report their information starting from 1st of January next year. Obviously, if a business is in Cohort 1 and they report on a financial year basis, in other words, from July to June, their first reporting year will begin from July 2025. And then obviously, as you can see on the screen there, that requirement ratchets down to Cohort 2 and Cohort 3, which I'll explain a bit more about. So in terms of what assurance will be required, so the disclosure process will expand over time. But in the first instance, in the first year of reporting, if we take Cohort 1, companies will be required to disclose their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions and have those emissions adhered to limited assurance, so receive limited assurance against those emissions, as well as other limited assurance against their governance practices and strategy disclosures. And then over time, moving from limited assurance to reasonable assurance. So limited assurance is I guess more of a higher level kind of review of whether the company is missing anything glaringly obvious. In this case, with respect to their emissions, governance, and strategy disclosures. But reasonable assurance moves to a greater level of granularity and certainty, basically more like an audit, like a financial audit, rather than a high level review. So over time, businesses are expected to improve in the accuracy and completeness of their data, as well as their responses to those other disclosures. There is obviously a process for managing non-compliance. Officially, non-compliance is a civil penalty, kind of like if you're not submitting your financial report, director's report, and audit reports. But I think there's still a process of working out exactly what that looks like. In terms of how we sort of break out the 3 cohorts or the 3 groups, you can see on the screen there, and I won't sort of read through it, but you can see on the screen how Group 1, Group 2, and Group 3 are kind of specified. Group 1 being the largest businesses, who will be the first sets of businesses required to respond to these disclosures. And then obviously Group 2 from 2026-27 reporting year, and Group 3 from 2027-2028. So you see how that reporting requirement captures a larger group of businesses across Australia as the next couple of years progresses. In terms of what needs to be reported, there's a bit more detail here on the breakdown of each disclosure requirement. You've got the governance perspective, which obviously breaks down describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities, and describe management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. Then we've obviously got the strategy disclosures section there as well, which, as you can see, talks about describing climate-related risks and opportunities the company has identified, how it's assessed those risks and opportunities, as well as what kind of impact or implications those risk opportunities might present to the business in the short, medium, or long term. Then you've got the risk management disclosure, and then the metrics and targets, as you can see, which is obviously one of James's favourite topics of discussion around data, and Wattwatchers' vein of work, which is around disclosing Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, in particular with respect to things like electricity, around Scope 2 and gas and other Scope 1 emissions, and then Scope 3 emissions with respect to the broader value chain. And then obviously other metrics and targets, considering what kind of targets have been set and how they get presented out to the market. This is just an important slide, I think, just to sort of get people across the fact that you don't need to solve the world's problems in the first year. So over time, as I said, the disclosure requirement will expand. In the first year of reporting, limited assurance around Scope 1 and Scope 2, those governance disclosures and identification and assessment of material risks and opportunities. And then in the second, third year reporting, obviously that level of disclosure expands. So reasonable assurance across Scope 1 and 2, and then expanding there over time from the fourth year onwards. And obviously limited assurance with Scope 3 emissions and those other disclosure requirements. I know I'm ripping through it, guys, but just there's a lot to get through in a short period of time, and I just want to make sure we're allowing for conversation. So I just want to end this sort of preliminary slide deck with just some observations of what's preventing businesses so far from wanting to respond to these disclosures or responding to them in an effective way. Now, with that, I think a lot of the businesses we work with around these disclosures, there's obviously a genuine intent and interest to respond to these disclosures, whether they see it as an opportunity or whether they just see it as just ticking the boxes for compliance. But we're noticing some common areas of blockage or resistance. And I guess the first thing is sort of access to skills. So a lot of the businesses we're working with, I mean, they don't know what climate-related risks are or really look like. Like, what is a physical climate risk and what's a transition climate risk, and how the hell do we identify these things? How do we assess them? Also, if you drill a bit deeper to, how do you analyze the impact, the implications of these climate risks on short, medium, and long-term financial performance? Like, there's a level of skill set and capability that needs to exist within the company, as well as obviously for externally with consultants like ourselves, that isn't, it's not widely accessible in the market at the moment, right? When we talk about quantitative scenario analysis, so the impact of climate-related risk opportunities on the company's short, medium, long-term finances. Like, there's a lot to unpack there to model that out. So accessing the right skills to meet these disclosures is a real challenge right now, right? There's a definite undersupply of capability in the market to respond to these disclosures effectively. Access to financial resources is another one as well, and whether that's, you know, a company having enough money to pay for a consultant like myself or others to help them respond to these disclosures, or whether it's accessing the right financial resources for systems and other things like that is a challenge. And speaking of systems, this is another thing too. This is something that we kind of highlight, that, you know, it's one thing to meet the disclosure requirements. It's another thing to maintain ongoing compliance. And to be able to maintain ongoing compliance, you need the right internal systems and processes in place, and not just a system like a software system or a way of, you know, housing documents and preparing documents and tracking data and things like that, but also what's the protocols in place for people within the company? What does the CFO do? You know, what does the sustainability manager do? What does the chief operations officer do? What does the administration officer do? What are the responsibilities required to assist this process going forward? Providing access to timely, accurate, and meaningful data is a massive challenge right now, and I think this dovetails very nicely into this broader discussion with yourself, James, which is, and with the audience, which is, you know, how do we ensure that we're able to provide data that can receive assurance, even limited assurance? How can we effectively collect and ensure that the data that we're getting around our scope 1 emissions, around our electricity, around our scope 3 emissions. How do we ensure that all this is accurate enough? And how do we ensure that we have to access it in an ongoing way? Which is why the timely piece is really important, right? If your data is more accurate, then it prepares you for that reasonable assurance over time. So I just want to make those points there too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, we often think about, we'll come to the net zero journey in a moment and what people are doing on it, but a lot of the things people are doing, and a common one like solar is a very good example. These investments are not set and forget. They've got to be managed once they're out there to make sure they continue to perform and deliver. And the data acquisition and measurement for disclosure and reporting is one piece of the puzzle. And you've got this whole asset management piece as well to make sure that everything keeps working out there.
Yeah, exactly. It's a linchpin of this whole disclosure process, is access to that data.
Absolutely. You ready for me to take the reins again, Nick?
Go for it, James.
Excellent. There you go. Thanks, Dan, bringing up that slide. So I thought, thanks very much, Nick, for that quick review on the ASRS changes that are coming in 2025 and how they're staged. So that's been really interesting to see and learn about. I thought I'd just give us a quick overview as well of, we're talking about compliance in a very broad way. We've got the ASRS coming, which has got some defined timelines. We've got a number of other frameworks in sustainability and regulatory regimes that are also changing. And there's lots of changes across even National Construction Code, NABERS, Commercial Building Disclosure, GRESB and Green Star. I'm not going to get into the detail of them all here, but I will pull out a few key messages. But it's fair to say that all of these frameworks are making multiple changes to move towards all electric buildings and more towards net zero. So the last update of the National Construction Code was fantastic to see. Had a big update when it came to energy management systems, because it focused on making the data from those systems that were being deployed actually usable and accessible. So clearly a really important part of making those systems work when put into the right hands. Now, what's sort of coming in the next version of the NCC, which is in National Construction Code 2025, will be kind of a really big focus on net zero preparedness. So this is going to have major inclusions around, one of the big ones is going to be a big upgrade to thermal efficiency standards, but also around electrification of buildings, particularly focusing on renewables and electric transportation for those sites. And the energy monitoring piece around capturing those as well as provisioning for those is going to be really key. Now, that consultation with the public and industry has closed and is sort of, they're aiming for a 2025 timeline, but you know the National Construction Code, things often get delayed there. So I think it's one to watch for next year for its release. But usually once everything has been set and decided and agreed, there's a transition time to implementation. So May 2025, they're aiming to have the final code locked in with probably a 12-month period until that new code applies. Now, metering in the National Construction Code is really used for delivering on the requirements for energy monitoring in this section J9, and it applies for everything that is either a sole occupancy over 500 square meters or any commercial building over 2,500 square meters. So it's got broad applicability to what's out there and is a mandatory requirement for those building types. One of the really interesting spaces has been NABERS, and which sort of traditionally is very well known for its performance in office, and over time, over the last couple of years, has been expanded into more and more asset types, which is really good to see, and for good reason. In the office space, NABERS has resulted in 35%, somewhere between 35 to 41% energy reductions for all of the participating buildings. There's been an expansion in offices down to 1,000 square meters, which includes a mandatory disclosure when there's a property is leased or sold or sublet. And so disclosing that NABERS rating, is really great to see happening at a smaller scale building than what was traditionally targeted. There is an expansion coming up for the mandatory disclosure of these NABERS ratings through the Commercial Building Disclosure Program. There's a consultation underway. A consultation's been finalised and is going to government now, so in this month. So it's something to watch in 2025 because that'll be pretty exciting. So the aim is to expand the energy rating disclosure using NABERS for buildings like new retail premises and these sorts of things when they are leased or sold. So it'll be a big expansion of that NABERS program, and with the thinking behind it being that we'll also be able to drive these energy and carbon reductions through into those new asset classes, which would be fantastic to see. Now, in the NABERS and Commercial Building Disclosure Program, the metering plays a role of measuring inclusions and exclusions. So a good example of that is let's say I have a big warehouse and it's got some office space or a cafe. I'm allowed to measure those areas that are not warehousey style storage space or those sorts of things, and I can remove them for the rating. Same with offices and spaces like cafes and car parks. They can be removed from those ratings by measuring them. In addition, metering plays a really valuable role in understanding any on-site generation, most commonly renewables and solar, and also understanding what's happening with electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging and what they contribute to the overall building consumption and how much they're being utilised on sites. So finally, there's sort of GRESB and Green Star, and on GRESB and Green Star we have there's sort of over the years they've been getting lots and lots of traction and adoption, and we see sort of GRESB in particular, and Green Star actually, playing a big role in the adoption of particularly Scope 3 emissions, and metering plays a really valuable role in capturing that Scope 3 emission. And to your point before, Nick, I mean, it's a bit confusing sometimes when we talk about this, but if I'm a tenant in a building, if I'm the operator, Scope 2 emissions is my electricity emissions. If I'm a landlord, and let's say in a warehouse and Coles is my tenant, the landlord, the electricity emissions associated with that site are actually a Scope 3 emissions for the landlord. And so that Scope 3 emission under GRESB and Green Star, can be quite valuable in baselining the performance of those assets and tracking performance over time, as well as picking up renewable energy generation for those sites. So before I step into the next piece, I thought that I would provide a little more context about what Wattwatchers does, but I promise I'll be very quick. We make cost-effective energy monitoring devices that look like this. They operate wirelessly, and they have inbuilt communications. They can be deployed and delivered without connecting to any company IT networks, and we avoid the complexity of integrating with local infrastructure like BMS and EMS, which just makes installation simple. A lot of companies want your data to be locked up into proprietary systems, where our approach is much more to set your data free and allow that to be used in the platforms required and accessible to the stakeholders that need it to make good decisions in your business. And we do this securely quickly and with the cloud infrastructure to make Wattwatchers highly interoperable. We power apps and services that look like this, and this just makes Wattwatchers, using Wattwatchers faster and more cost effective than traditional technologies. So our technology provides a broad ecosystem of partners. On the left-hand side, you see a number of software partners that we have that are there to help exploit many different use cases and deliver on those. Everything from solar PPA billing to home energy management to sustainability reporting and energy management. In the center, you see some of the clients we're working with, and often GRESB and Green Star and ASRS and NABERS are all part of what these companies are trying to deliver on, as well as to continue to maintain those assets that they've deployed. And so on a typical net zero journey, there's a number of things people are doing, sort of rating and baselining assets, understanding their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. They're reducing their energy consumption, so investing in efficiency, deploying clean energy, and there's a big shift now onto electrifying as much as possible and switching as many loads to electricity. And then I suppose finally, there's two really important steps. So the next is to offset and communicate the results. But importantly, you see at the bottom there to verify and maintain the assets that are deployed. So verify the investment is stacking up to the original business case, and ensuring that that you're on track and maintaining those assets to keep them working. Now, I suppose it's useful to touch a little on some of the complexities of modern assets and operating them. And so today in modern assets, there are lots of different stakeholders involved with lots of different demands. We've got dev teams trying to comply with the Green Star and a National Construction Code requirements. Sustainability managers, once assets are in operation, need detailed information about renewable energy generation and carbon emissions, often by tenant. Public disclosures need to be made based on good quality data. We've got ops teams out there trying to keep assets operating and detect faults in real time. And we've got the occupant and the tenant in those cases who are managing the site and need the tools to be able to manage energy and reduce costs in their business. And so when we look at the stakeholder complexity, the sort of traditional energy management systems are actually really not set up to deal with this kind of complexity. They typically are on-site terminals, on-site computers. You may need to be on-site to see the data, not always internet connected. The best just sort of logging on to an on-site computer. There's limited reporting and visualization capability. It's difficult to get out to shareholders, to different stakeholders in the business. And it's difficult to roll up across sites, or just costly to roll up across sites, usually hardware solutions to do that with bespoke professional services at every site. And so this sort of traditional cable method back to a central computer on site tends to be really costly to do if you're doing a sort of retrofit to multiple locations. And there's three key challenges with the traditional systems. The first is data management. So I suppose data management is everything that you need to do to consolidate, clean, validate, calculate all the KPIs that you want to track and measure for your sites. Now, many larger customers that we work with describe this data management piece alone being like a small village of people in one of these companies working with tenants to try and grab information, and just in an effort to collate that for once a year. If you've got multiple sites, you really want sort of data to be automated, and so that can be used not only for reporting, but also ongoing management of those sites. And when you've got multiple stakeholders, it's often required that that data is presented in multiple places, in multiple platforms, and visualized in the right way for a certain type of decision making, depending on who that stakeholder is. And so with sort of that in mind, there's a couple of case studies I'd like to just step through to help bring some of this to life. The first is really from a recent pilot that we had. Now, this is an industrial client, one of the sort of self-storage players that we've been working with, hundreds of sites around Australia, and this pilot delivered on 20 locations. Now, in the first month, we found around about, through energy monitoring, that 60% of these sites had issues. Most commonly high baseload, which actually the energy monitoring was able to identify sites that had automation equipment that was actually installed, but was not functioning. And so the integrations between access control and lighting weren't working, and other lighting controls based on light sensors and time clocks weren't working either. And so that was sort of interesting because people were out there after hours and weren't observing. And so the energy monitoring was able to, I suppose, pick up those sorts of issues across multiple locations. In the space of a month too, it's just interesting to see that there was 10% of the solar systems that were operating needed on-site attendance to be able to get them back online. And in addition, one of the sites had solar deployed and was just sort of massively oversized for the site. So looking at the amount of export from that particular location, it was able to be identified that it was a suitable candidate for energy storage. And battery storage can now be sort of sized, once that information is known. And so that chart at the bottom there, for those that love a chart, is that's the black line there is showing you the high base load, and the grey shaded areas are showing you the operating hours. So you can see on that particular site, that wasn't changing due to the automation issues. Now, here is just a live customer journey that we're working on with one of the big REITs. Sort of interesting that this journey started kind of where we started, acquiring data to make public disclosures to track the performance of their portfolio in GRESB and Green Star. We then sort of moved on to tenant engagement, and tenant engagement in this case starts with an app and putting that in the hands of the tenant, but can also result or get more detail with engaging professional services to take a deeper look at sites. Then we have this particular client has lots of solar, like hundreds of kilowatts deployed or megawatts deployed across these facilities, and they've got a third-party solar O&M partner to help manage those assets and make sure they're continually operating. And also, with such a large portfolio of more than 550 tenants, they're really interested in using digitization technologies to streamline their operations. And so looking at that operational automation. Now, this seems like a pretty logical journey, but one of the complexities here, I suppose, is that all of these things are happening in separate platforms with different sets of stakeholders. And so being able to get data to these different platforms is kind of key to making all of that happen and unlocking all this value, not only for reporting, but tenant engagement, asset management, and operational automation. Now, one of the key things that you'll see a lot of, I suppose, is solar being deployed. This isn't an industrial and logistics portfolio; it's a schools portfolio. But this shows around about 800 schools with energy monitoring deployed, where I think energy monitoring played a really interesting role in a few ways. The first, it was used for real-time commissioning to make sure that those sites were operating as expected from the time that they were installed. Secondly, any sites that went offline or had performance issues, there's actually algorithms in this platform to check solar performance, and any sites that were underperforming on their savings guarantee were able to be identified, and any inverters that went offline could be identified and responded to. And so the SLAs that the manager of this had around that portfolio were, very well managed, with only a handful of sites or a few sites across a very large geographic area at any time having issues that weren't that prevented it from delivering on the savings guarantee. So it's able to be very tightly managed. Now, I realise one of the other common deployments, I suppose, is around electric vehicles and electrification of transport. And this is very common in commercial buildings and industrial sites, with the addition of trucks, electric vehicle transport for visitors and for staff. I suppose we're seeing the UK as a bit of a leading market here in terms of deployment and its process. Now, in the UK, to be able to connect electric vehicle chargers, there's quite a detailed permissioning process you have to go through with the network owner, which we expect that to happen here. And that sort of involves detailed measurement of what's happening on site at the grid, and both with voltage and current and frequency, as well as kilowatt hours and kilowatts. So you need quite a detailed assessment to be able to deploy electric vehicle chargers over there. And once those chargers are deployed, that's fantastic, but you have to manage peak load on those sites. So some of these sites have 15, 20 electric vehicle chargers, and certainly energy monitoring technology can play a role in helping manage that demand, because if you just add up the capacity of all those 15 or 20 EV chargers and try and add that to the site capacity, it's going to cost you a very big number that is unfeasible. And so managing demand dynamically is really important when deploying the electric vehicle infrastructure. And we're seeing that happen a lot in the UK now. But I think one of the gaps that we're seeing in this space is that electricity data is not being considered as an asset in its own right, and so it's been underutilized and contained. And if you're looking, and if you can sort of think through that barrier and that shortcoming, you can use electricity data to help empower your net zero journey. And here's a sort of list of considerations that I've come up with to help select the right technologies to make sure that you can use it for all these different use cases that span sustainability reporting, NCC compliance, tenant engagement, and asset management. And so with that, I realise we are a little over, but I thought let's open up the floor to any questions. I mean, Nick, did you want to get us started with an answer? Perhaps you can tell us, you're working a lot in the ASRS space. Are you able to tell us, I suppose, the kinds of things that people are focusing on now? And if people aren't impacted by this first wave of compliance, what's your advice to people that are affected in the future?
Yeah, well, I think businesses right now, they are maybe just getting past this state of panic as the first thing. I think they're seeing what's coming through. They're looking at it going, well, that's a hell of a lot of work to prepare for these disclosures, and it is. It's not a small amount of work. But I think where a lot of businesses are at right now is that, okay, let's work with what we have more, what data we can access more easily, which is why they're working, I guess, in the first instance around the developing the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions inventory. That, I guess, is where they're starting right now. Our approach to the disclosures process is just trying to take this functional, steady as she goes approach. The smarter businesses, I mean, the Group 1 companies, if you haven't started now, you are behind the 8 ball. Like, there is a lot of work to do. And, if you're just expecting that someone external is going to come in and save the day, a lot of those external consultants are busy getting swallowed up by other Group 1s doing things, right? So So as a Group 1 company, getting a move on, if you haven't started preparing for disclosures, is a good sort of place to start. But I think overall what we suggest to our clients is slow and steady. Like the most cost-effective, reliable, value-adding way of preparing for these disclosures is to take a slow and steady approach towards preparing your greenhouse gas emissions data, preparing for doing the risk assessment, those kinds of things. I think also reinforcing to our clients that if you've got to spend all this money and time preparing for these disclosures, make it work for you beyond just compliance. Right? You leverage all this work as a source of competitive advantage. Leverage this work as a conversation starter with customers, or as a way to identify, material risks and opportunities for which you can reposition the business over time to adapt to. So I think that's sort of our advice to businesses who are either in Group 1 or preparing the next sort of couple of years. That's kind of my view. I was going to ask you a question, James. So I think we had Caroline on LinkedIn ask a question around how this product can be useful for technology companies dealing with emissions mainly coming from IT data systems. So I think that's a Wattwatchers question. James, do you have an answer to that one, to Caroline's question?
Yeah. Look, it'd be great to pick up that conversation. I mean, I think one of the coming waves of efficiency and efficiency regulation in Australia is actually going to be, like, we've sort of done data centers, if you like, and data centers have NABERS ratings associated with them, and metering plays a valuable role there. In particular, our organisation has worked with what we call energy performance contractors in that space that use very detailed data from energy monitoring to optimize data center performance and then measure and verify the impact of that. And they're able to monetize certificates through that from New South Wales and Victoria, the VEECs and the ESCIs, under that scheme, which is which is pretty cool, and just knock a whole bunch of operational costs off those facilities. Now, in something like a data center, reducing load makes more room for revenue. So if you reduce your base load, you can install more racks, you can make more money. And so energy efficiency has this, double-edged sword there. It's a cost saving, but also an opportunity to open up more revenue. There's also a question there about, let's go for it. Is that Penelope?
That's Penelope. Thanks for the question, Penelope. So the question is, I work for a large not-for-profit, so we're not required to report yet. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on voluntary reporting. It's a really good question. We're working with a number of non-for-profits at the moment, Penelope, on voluntary reporting against the ASRS, climate-related financial disclosure standards. So there are a few non-for-profits that we're working for already on this voluntary reporting process. Their motivations, and hopefully you can hear me okay. I think there's an issue with that. My microphone, hopefully it's okay. You can hear me okay, James, can't you? James, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. So a number of the non-for-profits we're working for at the moment on this, their motivations are driven by, partially it's a values position. We're a non-for-profit, we work in the field, we want to seem to be doing the right thing. But a number of non-for-profits we're working with are preparing for what their customers or donors will be asking for. So, customers of certain non-for-profits, for example, that we're working with are asking for their Scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions associated with a non-for-profit that are supplying the services. Or donors, for example, are, as part of their donation process, looking at things from a carbon and climate risk perspective. So there are quite a few reasons for non-for-profits to be doing this, preparing for this, responding to those disclosure requirements beyond compliance. And frankly, there are a lot of companies we've worked with over the last 12 years that have been on this journey, irrespective of the disclosure requirements. And they've been doing it for all the business reasons that we're talking about beyond just compliance. So Penelope, that would be my advice to you, if that's of interest to you, is to position those disclosures as, how is this creating value for a non-for-profit? How is it mitigating our risk with our customers, with efficiencies and other things like that? And
awesome. And I think there was a question earlier from Dan too, asking about some of the risks if we don't meet these, and some of the advantages of staying on top of them. I mean, it's kind of interesting, Nick, I might let you speak to the ASRS stuff, but certainly when it comes to some of the, as sort of Nick was saying, in property, we're seeing a lot of the leading organizations actually doing voluntary disclosures on things like GRESB and Green Star, because investors really want that information, and it's a credible way to actually track your progress in your property portfolio. Now, on something like NABERS ratings, there's been a lot of research done, but in some asset classes, there's sort of a green premium you can attract by having a high NABERS rating, but there's also a brown discount. So if your NABERS rating drops too low, it's a sign that your building is highly energy efficient, has high operating costs, and so reduces the value of the asset. And so beyond, I suppose, so one of the big risks in the building space is the devaluation of your asset by not keeping on top of things like some of the voluntary disclosures like NABERS and Green Star and GRESB. So Nick, over to you if you've got anything to add around the ASRS.
Yep, absolutely. Hopefully you can hear me a lot bit better now. I had to fix my microphone. I think we had a few folks in the chat there concerned about my sounding a little bit muffled, so apologies for that. We have a question from Kevin. I think the question is, understanding that this is important to everyone and we should all be doing our part, is it correct that cohort 3 don't need to do anything in this regard until 2027? That is correct, Kevin. If you're in group 3, officially you don't need to be reporting against this until 2027 as a company reporting against the disclosure requirements. But it depends on what kind of, I think the devil's a bit more in the detail in terms of, like, you may not be required to report against the disclosure requirements officially, but if you're a cohort 3 company that is supplying to a cohort 2 or a cohort 1 company, those cohort 2 or cohort 1 companies will be asking you as a cohort 3 company possibly questions around your greenhouse gas emissions, because they're going to start to track their scope 3, and you are in the supply chain, therefore you are part of their scope 3 emissions footprint inventory. So that's something I think to be wary of, is depending on where you are in the value chain, the kind of business you are, you might not need to officially do anything for compliance sake for a couple of years time, but think of the top 500 companies in Australia, the clout they have, and how many businesses are in those supply chains of those big companies. Those big companies will be asking for that data sooner rather than later. So that's something to be prepared for.
Excellent. So we've had some great engagement there, which has been wonderful. And thank you very much for your questions. I know that we've gone a little bit over. Look, we are happy to stay if there's more questions, but I really want to thank everyone for making time for coming today and making time for the session. Look, we're happy to be contacted on LinkedIn, obviously, after this event about any of the stuff that we've spoken about today. And so unless there's any further questions, thank you very much for your time, and we'll sign off here.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's great to talk. Thanks, James. Thanks all. Have a good day.
Thanks, Nick. See ya.